Hey guys, Jay Wilson from Onyx Reporting here. Today I'm going to do a video tutorial about how to mimic Vlookup based on date ranges. Actually, that's a total lie. What we're actually going to learn how to do is we're going to learn how to write window functions in MySQL. Now, if that seems obvious to you why we would need to do the thing, go ahead and jump ahead to where I actually start writing code. But I'm going to take a minute to kind of explain to James here how I arrived at the conclusion that a window function, specifically the lead function, will help him solve his problem. So what does James have? He's got a set of data that shows daily sales per customer. Then he's got another table that shows a history of who managed that customer. And his goal is to mimic the lookup function that can do an approximate match in Domo. Here's the thing, James. Unfortunately, if you were to go out there and Google Vlookup Domo, you probably aren't going to find too much useful content other than people saying it doesn't exist. Fair enough. What I recommend you do when you have problems like this is try to break it down into if I had to do this by hand, how would I accomplish the thing? What process would I follow? And then can I do possibly a better job of defining what I have available to me in my data to help support that process? In other words, specifically when we look at the history of who managed that customer, what I would ask a client, if you were a client of mine, I would ask you, okay, what is the granularity of the data? What does one row in the data mean? And how does a new row arrive in the data set? Let's assume for the sake of conversation that you get a new row is added to the table anytime a new rep is assigned to this customer. So then then the date column is not just the date, it is the start date of the relationship. And then the end date is the date of the next row. And as soon as you say, oh yeah, the end date is the date of the next row, then you know that's a lead function. Or at least if you didn't know that, you can Google, how do I get the next row, value from the next row? And you'll find that it's a windowed function, that's the lead function. And there's plenty of examples of how to do that on the internet. So that part's reasonably straightforward. The next thing you'll run into, though, specifically with MySQL, is that MySQL version 8 was the first version, it looks like, to support window functions. And MySQL version 5.6 does not have window functions. And why am I talking about Windows 5.6? Or sorry, MySQL 5.6? Well, that's because that's the version of MySQL that Domo is using. And you might ask, Jay, how do you know these things? Well, you can run select a version if you have an input data set. Hold on. You can run select a version and it tells you 5.6. And so that's the version, those are the rules. We have to follow syntax and stuff that works in MySQL 5.6. And that's why we're going to have this tutorial. All right, guys, here we go. Now, again, when I'm starting a new MySQL ETL, what I like to do is I like to clean up. I want to have a column. Let's start with select star. I'm sorry. Let's preview the data first. Cool. So here's all of my data. It's the same as the data from the dojo, only I've added a new customer 66789. And what's interesting is all of the nulls are actually identified as nulls, which is a super cool change in the UI. And you can find that here in this little click-through thing. And I can choose to show or hide nulls. That's spectacular because now I'll be able to filter more efficiently on the difference between a null or a space or just an empty string. Also, the use of monospace we'll make it such that each character is spaced equal distance apart, again, making it easier to identify a single space or a double space. So good job, Domo, on updating the UI. I'm going to make a clean version of this data set and just do a quick rename of some columns. And for now, I'm going to choose to exclude cases where this new sales rep is null. And for now, I'm only going to focus on one customer ID. Cool. Sweet deal. Now let's remind ourselves of the mission. The mission is to create a column called end date, where the end date is the value from the next row. And again, when you can frame it in those terms, then you would be able to Google and figure out that the function that I wish I could write is this. And you can write that in Redshift, and you can write that in Magic ETL. But today's tutorial is about how to do it in MySQL. All right. Now, I hope you know that you can, if you wanted to create a column called end date, you could assign that in the select clause if you included a comma. We know how to add a constant. That's one way of adding a constant. Another way of adding a constant is to cross-apply the column in my from clause. So I can write this. I can alias the result of my select statement as an R, alias rather, and this will work. Okay. Now, what a cross apply does is it's different from a join. Because with a join, you define what is the relationship between column table A and table B. So that's the on clause. With a cross apply, there is no on clause. So functionally, I'm saying stick this query onto every row of table T. And so that's the cross apply. In my tutorials, you'll have seen me do join on 1 equals 1. That will get you the same result. I'm going to do a little formatting so it's cleaner. Okay. Now, what I can also do is I can create a variable. So I can create a variable called @t_date, and I'm going to assign it the value using colon equals. I'll assign it the value 0. Then up here, I can say, give me the variable t_date. It's set to the value of 0. I could set it to the value 3, and it will work. And I can even rename it or call it multiple times. How cool is that? Super cool, Jay. Super cool. Now, what what I can also do is I can assign the value of the variable in my select statement, and then it will get evaluated one row at a time. So what happens if I do this? Well, it breaks because the column is called start. Cool. Let's take a look. So for my first row, oh, why don't I have any reps? Oh, because I did is null instead of is not null. Sorry. For my first row, the start date is 5/19/2018. But at the time of execution, previous date hadn't been assigned a new value, so it still had the default value of 123. Then I assigned it the value of start date, which is 2018-19, Feb 19. For the next row, I'm looking at March 15 now. The value of t date is still the value that it was previously assigned. But then on the next row, I apply it here to 3/14. So actually, functionally, what I've done is I've created a column for the previous date. That's pretty cool. I don't want the previous date. I want the next date. I want the lead, not the lag. So all I have to do is order by start date, descend. By adding an explicit order by clause, I change the order that the rows appear in my table. And so now, April 28th, the next row, well, there is no next row, but December 4th was valid until 2020-04-08, which is the same value from. And let me, instead of calling this previous date, because that's confusing, let's call that end date. And you know what? I would like date to be, instead of text, I want this to be type date. So let me do cast t date as a date. There it is. Really quickly, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back and fix these nulls. This should have been is not null. Okay. So that's good. We have the start of our window function. Ultimately, I will ignore the underscore date column because the only columns I care about are my start date and end date. But we have an interesting problem. Right now, I'm only looking at one customer. What happens when I look at all customers, 6123 as well as 66789? Let's come here into my transform and run it again. And let's see what happens. So now the rep for 61323 is Megan. She was assigned on June 1st, and she's the current rep. But let's look at our man Tony. Our man Tony is a rep for 789. He was assigned on April 20th, but reassigned, or the rep was changed on June 1st. But we know, hey, that's wrong. That's not the right rep. So you might say, well, Jay, what if you add an order by clause and order by the customer ID and then the start date? Let's look at that. This is already starting to look better. Paris was the rep on August 27th, and then they were reassigned to June 1st to Megan, and it's the same rep. And because, here's the deal, because the rep on the current row is equal to the rep on the next row, I know the end date is correct. But let's look at what happened here. Here's the transition between customer 1 and customer 2. Tony was the rep on April 20th, but then was no longer the rep May 17th, 2016. That's wrong. Tony is still the current rep, but the lead function is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It's getting the value from the next row. And so what we want to do is we want to actually say, hey, just kidding. I only want to include the value from the next row if the reps are the same. So let's define another variable here. T rep is equal to 0. And then I said I only want to do the thing if. So I need a case statement. Case when t.rep is equal to at t underscore rep. Then give me the date. Let's do an else null end. And that's my case statement. So if the rep on the current row is equal to the rep variable, then I have the right date. Otherwise, I don't. So when I run that now, I get all nulls. And that's interesting. The reason why I get all nulls must be that t.rep is never equal to the rep variable. Well, what's the value of the rep variable right now? Well, I didn't assign it a value, so it must be 0. So to solve that, I'll say at t_rep is equal to the rep. So I'll force it to assign the thing. I'll call it underscore rep so I can ignore it. And what did I do wrong? Uh-oh. So when you're getting your value from this row, ID, not rep. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Should be matching on IDs, not on reps. Oh no. Customer IDs. There. So now I've got nulls in 2 places, and I was testing the rep column instead of the ID column. Okay, but now I can see I've got 2 sets of nulls. On April 8th, 2020 is the last row that Tony has a value, that has a value. So that's correct. And then I'm looking at Paris. Paris was on the account from August 27th. She was removed from the account on June 1st and replaced with Megan and null. So this is the right answer. Cool. So I can call this mgr lead. So the only thing left to do is to join it to SQL. So we'll say select star from, and let's call this t.star, and we'll take my oh, I haven't added my transaction. Sorry. Let's pull in my transaction. And then I'm going to do, now I can do a proper join because I have a start date and end date. So I can join on the date, transaction date is between lookup.startDate and lookup.end. And t.user ID is equal to lu.user ID. And then I want to retrieve lu.rep. And I need a comma. That's how we do the solution. Okay? So coming back to it, guys. What we learned how to do today is working our way from the from clause. Here's my from manager clean. I started by cross-applying basically empty or dummy variables to each row of the data set. And I create a variable by using the at and then variable name. I can assign a value to a variable using colon equals. And remember, assign is not the same as a test for equality. So if I want to assign a value, I use colon equals. If I just use equals, it will just test, are these two things the same? It's important to remember that the order that your variables appear in your select clause does matter. This will never yield the desired result because you're changing the variable before you get to your case statement. So just keep in mind that unlike pretty much everything else in SQL, well, in terms of the select clause, at this point, it really does matter the order that you put your columns in. Okay. Here in my case statement, we tested if the value for the ID on the current row matches the variable value. We wrapped it all in a cast as date to give it the right date, but I have an overlap, right? I have June 1 over here and a June 1 over there. And so my join on between clause is going to be wrong. Let me wrap all of this in a date add function. So that's going to give me a date. And I'll say interval -1 day. Yeah. Getting a little bit messy. Okay. So then I have a nice offset and there's no overlap in dates. This is the right answer. And that's your solution. Okay. Coming back to our VLOOKUP. Again, James, the trick to all of this was to try to frame your question in terms of like how would I do this if I had to do it by hand? How do I know what the right answer is if somebody handed me a pen and paper and a spreadsheet and said, go to work without using the VLOOKUP, right? The second piece of it was to carefully articulate how a row gets entered into the table. This is also called defining the granularity of the table using plain English. Once we were able to do that, we were able to say something along the lines of, okay, I want to get the date from the next row. When we frame it like that, we can then do a Google search on the thing, and that's a more general term, or that's a more general requirement that will exist in other implementations of SQL, effectively the partition and the windowing function. And that's how we got it done. My name's Jay Wilson. I am a freelance consultant. If you like the content that I'm creating, feel free to join and subscribe to the channel. But if you feel like you need support at your organization with Domo, feel free to give me an email or a holler at jae@onyxreporting.com. Catch you guys later. Bye.